So it's my pleasure to introduce Greta Tuckute. Am I pronouncing that okay? Somewhat okay. And she's finishing her PhD at MIT, a couple of blocks down the street of the Brain and Cognitive Science department. And she's working on at the intersection of AI, neuroscience, cognitive science, and she's going to talk to us about computational models of human auditory and language processing. People in the back, there are chairs available, so feel free to sit. Thank you.
Great, thanks for the introduction. And I think we got a mic upgrade. This seems to be working. Yeah, thanks to the organizers. I'm very excited to talk to you today about human auditory and language processing. Broadly, I think the premise of this talk is that we have all these amazing new models within machine learning, for instance, for speaker diarization or ASR or whatever, which has transformed so many engineering applications. And in this talk, I'll try to argue that these machine learning models can also transform the way in which we do cognitive science and neuroscience. And I'll provide some empirical results and show examples of that. Great, so let's get started with some high-level motivation. So right now, as you're listening to me speaking, you're basically going from the sounds that are just pressure waves in the air to the meaning that I'm trying to convey to you. And if you start thinking about it, this is, it's quite remarkable. It's basically transmission of information from my mind to yours. And this is all due to a code that we share, the language, we all speak the same language, that we know how to map between these speech sounds to their intended meanings. And that's what I study. Basically, the high-level question of my research is how do we extract meaning from text and speech? And, well, we have one system here that definitely performs that process incredibly well, and that is the human brain. And the human brain has, of course, many, many regions. Here I'll just broadly explain two regions that I'll keep using for the rest of my talk. One set of such regions that I'm showing here in the green outline is a set of auditory regions. And these are bilaterally, so on both hemispheres of your brain. They're in temporal regions, so they're pretty close to the ears. And these regions basically support auditory perception. So, to enable the conscious perception of sounds, the signal needs to flow through these auditory regions. Critically, these regions are not language regions. Like the auditory regions, they don't know the meanings of words or how the words go together. Instead, we actually have another network in the brain that I'll here call the language network or language regions, here shown in red. And this is a set of regions. Here I'm showing 5 regions, some in the frontal part of the brain, some in the temporal part of the brain. And these are lateralized to the left hemisphere, meaning that in most individuals, if I were to scan your guys' brains, I would find very strong activations in the left part of your brain. And these regions support what I here denote as higher level language processing, meaning that these regions deeply care about the meanings of words and the constructions and basically the ways in which we compose language, right? So these are not perceptual. If I were to speak a language that you don't know, then these regions would not care about it because, well, there's no meaning to extract there. And this is basically what I study, these like auditory and language regions. And these regions are pretty tricky to study and to learn more about what is going on, which representations, computations take place there. Some reasons are that when we study humans, language is arguably a uniquely human capacity. We need to measure brain activity, and most brain recording techniques are, they have their disadvantages. We can only get brain responses with like relatively low resolution in whichever, either temporally or spatially. Another reason is that ethically we cannot perturb the brain. We cannot perform a lot of cool causal experiments, unfortunately. And I spoke as a scientist. And of course, we can also not change the experience that the brain was exposed to. So we cannot perform these controlled rearing experiments where we just change the training data that a human was exposed to. But there's another system where we actually can do these things, and those are the artificial neural networks. And these models are, they're fully observable. We might not fully understand them, but at least we can try. We can use, model interpretability to look into them, and we can, do all like various causal lesioning analyses. And they are trained on biologically relevant tasks, such as, recognizing speech, identifying speakers, or predicting the next word. Critically, these models are not in any way originally trained to, mimic the brain like directly. I know there's been aspirations, but they're not trained to predict brain data. That's not the main objective here. So in this talk, I'll show you some examples of how we can leverage these artificial models, the ANNs, to study the human brain. And then in the end of the talk, I'll also talk about some new work on trying to develop slightly more biologically plausible human-like ANNs. So let's get started. And first, here is an outline. First, I'll talk about auditory processing. So these were the green regions that I showed before. And then I'll move on to higher level processes, so language processing. Those were the red regions here. And then finally end on some model building. Great. So first, some motivation and context for this particular half of the talk. Here, the motivation is to obtain a better understanding of the human auditory cortex. And understanding can mean many things, but one particular instantiation of understanding is just models that can predict the brain responses to any arbitrary sensory stimulus. So for example, if you have a given sound, whether it's speech or some other environmental sound, then we also have the brain. And if we have a model that can predict exactly what is going on in the brain at a given stimulus, that arguably constitutes some level of understanding if you can predict what a system, in this case, the brain is doing. So in this project, we aim to do exactly that. And we wanted to ask which models of artificial models would best capture brain responses in the human auditory cortex. And would different models or different model stages best capture distinct regions of the auditory cortex? So the main question here is, do these audio-based artificial neural network models capture brain responses in the human auditory cortex? And what insights about auditory process can we gain from these models? And this is work that I co-led with Janelle Feather and in collaboration with Dana Bobinger and Josh McDermott. So the approach that we took here, so we actually started this work in 2020. So that's kind of before this big boom of open source audio models. So we actually searched for the publicly available PyTorch models that we could find at the time, which was actually not that many. After we did this project, a lot has happened, which is great. But the models that we included in this project were kind of designed to take whatever that was easy to use out there, and also spanned various different model classes. So for instance, we have different architectures. There are CNNs, RNNs, transformers. And these models also span different training tasks. There is automatic speech recognition, speech enhancement, audio captioning, and so on. And no need to memorize this table at all. This is just to show the models that we use in this project. There's some classics. There's deep speech, and VGG-ish, wave-to-vec that people might be familiar with. And then in addition, we kind of had this grab bag of models that we could find online. Then in addition, we also trained 10 models ourselves to be able to perform slightly more controlled comparisons. And here specifically, we used two different architectures, a convolutional architecture and a ResNet architecture. And we had 4 different training tasks. The models were either trained to recognize the word in a given clip, recognize the speaker, recognize an environmental sound, or recognize a musical genre. And in addition, we also were able to train these multitask models, which are trained on 3 of these tasks simultaneously because we had a special data set where in a given short audio clip, you have a background sound, which is an environmental sound, could be like a cat, something else. Then on top of that, you have a speaker that utters a given word. And then you also have the speaker identity. So based on these clips, you can actually train a model to predict all 3 of these labels. And then in addition, as I started by motivating, we also changed the training data type. So for instance, we trained some models that were just trained on more like clean speech, like recognizing a word like with no background noise, and then other models that had a noise, like sounds in the background behind like the word, sorry. Great, and these models, also known as memorized stable, these models I broadly denote as like Coq CNN. Those are the CNN-based architectures. And the reason we denote as that is they're trained on like the cochleogram input, which is this human-like spectrogram representation. And then we also have the Coq ResNets that are also trained on these tasks that I just explained. And then just a last part of the approach methods to get us all on the same page. How would you compare these artificial models to representations going on in the human brain? There are many ways in which you can do that. The way we did it here is that you have a bunch of sounds, in this case, 165 everyday sounds, like the most common sounds that you would hear in your everyday life. I don't think toilet flushing is on this example, but that's actually one of the most common sounds, and that was a part of the experiment. Person screaming, maybe not that common, but frying pans, alarm clocks, like that kind of thing, like very everyday sounds. And then you present these sounds to participants, human participants who are lying in the fMRI scanner, and they're just listening to these sounds, basically. And as many of you may know, fMRI has like pretty slow temporal resolution. So these audio clips are 2 seconds long, so we get this time average representation for a given sound. But fMRI is really great in the sense that we actually get really nice measurements for like a big part of the brain, so across space. And we call these like small cubes of brain tissue voxels. And that's like what this cube represents. So that means that for every single voxel, for every single 3D cube in the brain, we get basically a response to each of these 165 natural sounds. And in this case, we used 2 independent data sets to test the robustness of our findings. One had 8 participants, and the other one had 20 participants. And this is a decent amount for human experiments in neuroscience. Well, now we can also take these 165 sounds and present them to the model. So in this case, the model is our experimental participant. And here we see an example of model architecture. And then, for a given stage of the model, we can present that sound, take the embedding representation associated with that sound at a given stage. And that means that we have a matrix of 165 sounds times number of units in that given model stage. And then to compare whether the representations in the model units, are similar to those taking place in the human brain, we can run a linear regression. So it means that you take the activations from the model, and then you fit a linear regression to basically predict the response of the brain to that given sound. And then to finally compare the similarity, you have the predicted sounds, and you have the actual response in the brain that was taking place for that given sound. And then you can compute a Pearson correlation between those 2 vectors, and then you get a proxy for, well, how well could this model actually account for what was going on in the brain at that given time. And this is one approach. We also generalize these findings to a completely non-regression-based method. I'm not going to talk about that, but happy to answer questions. So first question we asked here is, do some of these like artificial neural networks that I showed to you, do they even outperform traditional models of the auditory cortex? How much can deep learning help us here? And in these plots, I'll be showing on the y-axis a Spearman-Brown noise-corrected R-squared value, which is like the similarity metric for how well a model is able to predict the brain. So the higher, the better. And on the x-axis, I'm showing the names of the models that I just introduced. The line here is the gray horizontal line is a spectrotemporal filter bank. So just a linear filter bank consisting of various filters centered on spectral and temporal properties. So this is not a deep learning model. It's like what we view as a baseline. How far could you get with just filters and no training, no like deeper machine learning model. So these color bars now show the performance of the machine learning models. And as you can see, most of these models outperform this like spectrotemporal filter bank model. Not all. There's a couple of models that don't. Some of these are slightly smaller models. Yeah, we can basically see performance. Before I go a little bit into that, I'll say that this is on one data set. And we also ran these experiments on 20 other people. And this is highly robust. So it's not like something that really like fluctuates around. These are pretty robust results. And the takeaway here from this plot is that most of these audio-based network models can actually account pretty well for the human auditory cortex. And the best model here that I haven't talked much about yet is one of the models that was trained to perform these like 3 tasks simultaneously. So it's a ResNet instantiation of that. So I guess you could like post-hoc argue that the human auditory cortex also has to support a lot of auditory behaviors. And if you train models to perform various tasks, then that should give you more brain-like models. On to the second sub-question. Next, we asked whether these audio-based ANNs exhibit hierarchical layer region correspondence. And by that, I mean, imagine you have a given neural network, and you have the human brain. If you want that neural network to be a good model of what is going on in the brain, you would want it to at least like have some correspondence with early stages in the model should map to earlier stages in the human brain. So for instance, we in the human brain have a primary auditory cortex, which is where the signals come from the inner ear, after some other loops, but not going to talk about that. And then of course, the signal will propagate to other regions in the brain. And the premise here is, if you have a good like machine learning artificial model of the brain, then you would want like that the early stages of the model should map onto earlier processing stages in the human, and later stages to later processing stages in the human. So that's what we asked. Yeah?
This was like data from a task-based fMRI, right?
Yeah.
And for that, do you mind to repeat how do you gather the data?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a question on more clarification on the fMRI data.
What I mean is, if the participants are exposed to environmental audio or speech, and if it is a speech, the level of complexity and the domain of that may matter.
So questions about the what I hear, the stimuli that the participants and also the models are exposed to, and the complexity and what kinds of sounds and like the processes that would take place when you're exposed to those sounds. So all these sounds are 2 seconds long. So that means that there is no complex language here. Here we're studying auditory processing. So it means that either if you're listening to an environmental sound, that's the process going on there, or some of the clips with speech have like very short sentences. So it can maximally be a couple of words if it's 2 seconds. Yeah, thanks. Great, so now we're gonna ask, do these artificial models show some correspondence to the processing stages in the human brain? And to do that, we need to figure out what is the best predicting layer of a given artificial model. And to do that, we need to measure how well every single artificial layer can predict the fMRI data. So as I showed you, this was a schematic. We can obtain the unit activations from various stages in the model. And then we can ask, here on the x-axis, instead of models, I now have a given model layers. And then I can ask, well, what particular layer of this model is the best one? So we can, for every single part of the brain, we can ask basically which layer in this model best predicts the response in a particular brain region. And different models have different number of layers. So to make it comparable across model, we basically normalize this index between 0 being the earliest layer and 1 being the latest layer. And now I'll show you some brain maps that show the correspondence across the 15 best models, the ones that outpredicted the spectrotemporal model, where the color scale here shows the best layer at 0 is in blue, and at the latest, sorry, not the best, the earliest layer is at 0, blue, and the later layers are here in more red, yellow-y colors. And these two brains are, surface inflated hemispheres, showing in the black outline the primary auditory cortex. So this is what we would think of as the first processing stage traditionally and in neuroscience. And as you can see, this earlier part of the human processing stage also seems to be better predicted by these earlier stages, so more like greenish colors in the models. While when you move outwards from the primary auditory cortex, down and up, then actually later model stages better account for those responses there. And maybe that's a lucky coincidence, or maybe this just happens because the models are deep, or they have several stages. So to test that, we took all these neural network models, and then we just permuted all the weights. So you still retain the basic properties, but you basically scramble away the effect of training. So if you just permute the weights and obtain the activations, you don't see the same result, meaning that the fact that these neural network models are trained to perform a task causes them to create these representations that seem to instantiate these hierarchical representations. And yeah, we can also look at individual models. The map that I just showed was an average across models. Different models have slightly different patterns, but again, most models have this correspondence that doesn't hold if you permute the weights. So the takeaway here is that primary and non-primary human auditory cortex instantiates distinct types of representations that resemble earlier and later stages of a computational hierarchy in a model that has been trained to perform a given task. And then just finally, I'll have one slide on how does a model's training data modulate its ability to capture these brain responses. So to test that, we trained models to recognize either the word in a given clip or to recognize the speaker. And we had models that were just trained, in clean speech. There was no background noise. What many machine learning models were trained on at least a couple of years ago. Maybe it's switching a little bit more now to noisy data sets. And then we had other models that were trained to recognize, again, the word or the speaker, but there's background noise going on as well. And here the hash bars show the models that are trained on the hash bars show the clean speech ones, and the blank ones show the models that are trained with speech in a noise. And as you can see, these are summary aggregates, but on both data sets, you do see that if you train a model to recognize either the word or the speaker in these noisy environments, you really bump up the predictivity on the brain data. So that means that models that trained to recognize speech and background noise were more brain-like, potentially because hearing in noise imposes constraints on biological auditory representations. Great, and we did some more. I can look at the paper. Let me move on to the second part of the talk, where I'll switch from auditory processing more to language processing. So that is when we understand sentences and not just environmental sounds or whatnot. And I had a little summary. I can just go for that. Great. And before I start this, I need to convince you that do large language models, LLMs, and the human language system, so the red regions that I showed in the beginning, do they even show similarity in their responses? And in some work that we did a couple of years ago, we actually tested 43 different language models, like BERT, GPTs, other architectures, to their ability to also predict in similar ways that I showed for the auditory case, to predict while humans are reading or listening to sentences or stories. And what we found was that actually, some of these models, especially GPT models, actually, have a decent predictivity on human brain data, meaning that, these models seem to also capture something that is going on in the human language system, so moving beyond the auditory system. And yeah, the line here is what we call like how similar subjects are to each other. Great. So for this particular project, we claimed that there is some similarity between these like LLMs and the human brain, and then I was interested in pushing that further because if you have a model that can predict what's going on in the brain, you should be able to use that to control brain responses. And I wanted to ask whether that's possible. And that was published earlier this year. So yeah, the premise here, as I said, if you have an LLM that can predict the brain responses during language processing, then can we leverage this predictive power of the LLMs to identify new stimuli, new sentences that can maximally drive the responses up or down in the language network in new humans? So what I mean by that is, can I find some sentences that can drive the responses up in a given brain region? For instance, my skin feels like melting wax, maybe. Or can I find some other sentences that will really try to suppress the responses in a given brain region? And that's interesting because it will answer, are these LLMs accurate enough to non-invasively control brain responses implicated in higher level cognition? Like language is arguably somewhat higher level than perception. And this could be pretty tricky because humans have very diverse linguistic experience. Maybe the things that goes on in my brain is completely different from what's going on in yours, right? And it's also tricky because it's not a perceptual process. Language is not like you're taking a signal and then filtering it in a particular way. It's a little bit more complicated than that, I think. Second and finally, this will allow us to answer what kinds of linguistic input is a given brain region most responsive to. So if you figure out like, oh, this brain region responds really strongly to this particular stimulus or doesn't respond to this thing, then you can learn about what a system is tuned for, what is the system doing. And this takes inspiration from actually like old-ish neuroscience experiments from like the late 50s and 60s, where experimenters, Hubel and Wiesel, for instance, were recording from the cat visual cortex and found cells that were very, very selectively driven by like various orientations of light. So here we're trying to do something similar just for language. Great. So first we need to build a predictive model of the language system, so of these brain regions. So to do that, we had participants come in and read thousands of sentences. So thanks to the participants, it's not that exciting. And we had 5 participants do that. And we take their brain responses in these regions that are implicated in language processing. And ultimately, we get a vector of, for a given sentence, what is the brain response associated with each of these 1,000 sentences. And similarly, we can take a language model. In this case, because I started this also a couple of years ago. We took GPT-2XL, still a pretty good language model, I will say, and recorded the unit activations to these 1,000 sentences that the humans were also exposed to. And then what we are doing, like similar to in the auditory case, we are fitting a linear regression, here shown by the mapping model M, to predict this activation that's going on in the human brain. And this is great because now we have this model that can take as input any given sentence that you can just feed to your LLM, and then it can output the predicted language system's response. So basically how that looks is that if we have this given model, here on the x-axis I'm showing the cross-validated model prediction from this GPT-based model. On the y-axis I'm showing the actual normalized brain responses. That means that we can learn some kind of model of how what has a high response, what has a low response. And now what we're trying to do is we want to identify these sentences that either would drive the responses up or down. So kind of trying to extrapolate beyond this distribution that I just came up with. And yeah, as mentioned, we want to identify sentences that either drive or suppress the responses as much as we possibly can. And to do that, one approach is pretty brute force. You just search through like pretty much 2 million sentences and ask which ones are predicted to have high or low responses. We also had another method that was gradient-based, so you do replacements of tokens based on the predicted response. Either way, you come up with some sentences that are predicted to really activate these language regions. Changing PhD group, yes or not, or people on Insta be like, gross. So your language system, if this model is right, should be working pretty hard right now. On the other end, you see more, I guess, arguably boring sentences that are, we're sitting on the couch. That is such a beautiful picture. And then the question was, well, would this, work in new individuals? So you take a new person in and you scan their brain, and then you present these sentences along with the other 1,000 sentences, and then you ask, will it actually, give the difference that you hoped for? And these bar plots show the average fMRI response across 3 participants. The red one are the drive sentences, the blue ones are the suppressed sentences, and the gray one here is the 1,000 set. So as you can see, this actually worked. That's cool. We generalized it on a completely different experiment, completely different participants. Also, we saw the same trend. So taking a step back, this basically means that you can take an LLM and then use it to successfully modulate these brain responses to language in a closed loop way. And of course, this was not real time, but you could also envision doing this in like real time or at more temporal resolution and extend this in various ways. And then just to end this, I want to just one example of the scientific insight that we can gain from this is what kinds of linguistic input is then the language system responsive to. And here I'll talk about sentence structure. So I'll show this one plot, and this one plot shows on the y-axis the brain responses for all the sentences in this experiment. And the x-axis here shows the grammaticality of a given sentence. So these ratings we obtained from crowdsourced experiments where you just ask a participant, how grammatical does this sentence sound? And then they just rate that from 1 to 7, where 1 is not very grammatical and 7 is highly grammatical. And down here at 7, we see sentences that are very easy to process. They're very grammatical. They stopped in front of us. And up in the middle, you see more surprising sentences. I am progressive and you fall right. It's not completely not grammatical, but it's definitely also not fully grammatical. And then down here, I'm not even going to try to read them, but these are completely non-grammatical sentences that are almost more like word lists. And what we see here is that there is almost like a tuning of these brain regions to this structural property, meaning that if a sentence is very easy to process, you have relatively low brain responses. If a sentence gets like weird and surprising, there's something unusual about it, these brain regions will work really hard to try to extract as much meaning as you can, while if the input becomes completely, you can't even parse it, then the brain regions won't even respond anymore. So this shows that basically, these surprising sentences will elicit very high brain responses, but sentences that are easy to process or do not adhere to the natural statistics of language will elicit low responses. And I want to emphasize that I would not have been able to run this experiment without an LLM, because then that means that I would have, as an experimenter, I would need to come up with all these different sentences. And how would I come up with that? There's like millions of sentences I could run this experiment on. So in this way, I took the LLM and fit a predictive model, and then I made it generate or identify sentences that I can then run my way more targeted experiment on, and that can then help me gain these insights into like how are these regions responding, like what are the tuning properties, and so on. Great. I want to move on, just finish on this like last part on developing more human-like ANNs, which is definitely an interest of mine. That's a summary. Great. Of course, I've used, in the work that I've showed you, I've just used, LLMs or audio-based models that I could find online that have been like mostly developed in engineering context, right? So these models pretty much had nothing to do with human neuroscience. And that's great, we can use them, they're definitely useful, but ultimately if we want to really push this field even further, we need models that are more human-like and have like less non-biologically plausible assumptions in them. Because humans learn language through continuous speech. They learn to segment acoustic waveforms, and then they learn to map those segments into meaning while all being embedded in an environment and caretakers and so on. And most language models, they learn from like pre-tokenized text tokens, which is like, that doesn't seem like the best input that you would want if you need like a fully developmentally plausible model. There's like all the amount of training data, there are many things. And humans are able to perform many different tasks based on audio, whether it's interpreting the speech or recognizing the speaker, emotional tones, and so on. So I'm very interested in these models that just learn pretty much from continuous speech alone, and then can perform a wide array of tasks on them. And here I'll just note a couple of points on what I see that are the problems with current speech-based models, and quote-unquote problems, because obviously these models are great for engineering. They're only problems in the sense of you care about the biological plausibility of these models. Many audio models are trained, on reconstruction, like neural cortex. It's like high-fidelity reconstruction objective, which we don't think the brain is doing. And many models, like BERT-style models, like masked models, are trained again on input where you kind of need knowledge about the future states to fill in something that happened before, and arguably that's also not the most biologically plausible objective. Many contrastive models also leverage contrasting of many samples within a batch, like hundreds of thousands of samples, and it seems not realistic that the brain would be able to contrast like thousands of samples, pairwise distances in the human brain. And yeah, kind of tied to that, many popular models like Hubert have global clustering procedures where you just take all the embeddings and you run like a clustering procedure on them. And as we also heard in the previous talk, you need to come up with how many clusters do I want, and you can't learn from like the order, and there are many problems with that in itself. I'm gonna stop here. And then I'll just mention a direction that I'm interested in moving towards, which is to develop a speech representation model with a biologically plausible input representation that learns speech or good representations through simple causal autoregressive prediction. And we've taken some steps towards that. It's work in progress, joint work with Clement Koda from Stanford, and our advisors at Fedorenko and Dan Humans. So in this particular model, what we're proposing is that given an audio waveform, then we'll do something that is a little bit similar to what the ear and the inner ear, in particular the cochlea, is doing. Sorry, this should be cochlea. We know that given when you take a waveform, which is just the temporal information and the sounds, then we know that throughout like the process of the inner ear, we convert these to cochleograms, or a time frequency spectrogram representation, which no longer is purely temporal, but has both time and space. So in this particular model, we want input representations that kind of mimic that. So instead of the ear, we build a model that goes from the actual waveform to the cochleogram. What we do here is that we take the waveform, and then the objective of this model is to predict the cochleogram features. And then we kind of want to probe, like hone in on the representations at an intermediate stage in this model, under the assumption that maybe that is also the representation that could take place like in the inner ear, or like very early in the auditory hierarchy. So we do this through a bottleneck. In particular, we use an LFQ lookup-free quantization bottleneck inspired by VQ-VAE methods. So you just discretize the representations, and you obtain these tokens that we denote as cochlear tokens. And then next step is that now we have this like tokenized input. Then we want to feed that into another model, which we call CokeStream. CokeStream is a vanilla transformer because, as we've all seen, transformers are incredibly powerful and they work. And we wanted a model that can actually do things. So in this particular case, we take an autoregressive like vanilla transformer, and then we pass these cochlear tokens into this transformer model. And because we've already discretized and compressed the representation, we can actually train this model without an insane context length and insane memory requirements. Yep, that's there. And then this model is then trained to predict the upcoming cochlear token one by one, basically. And then finally, you can then take a cochleogram and you can pass in a part of a sound to the model, and then you can ask what is the continuation of this sound. Great. And of course, because this is somewhat a computer science talk, I do have to put one overleaf table in here. So here it goes. We asked whether the representations in our model, CokeStream, can actually learn to meaningfully probe out phonemes and words. So for this, we used the timid data set and just did linear decoding, pretty standard. And we compared it against Hubert XL, Wave2Vec large, WaveLM large. And CokeStream is our model, a base model, and a large version of it. And we tested phonemes. Our model, the large one, was almost as good as Hubert XL. It just beat us by a little bit. Our model was relatively worse at word decoding, which we hypothesized could be because many of these models are, like Hubert in particular, is trained on this global clustering procedure that kind of incentivizes finding the structure of word-like units. So yeah, we still need to do some work there. We tried another benchmark, which is semantic similarity, which is a zero-speech benchmark where you basically have two different auditorily presented words. It could be river and water. They don't sound similar, but they're kind of close in semantic space, right? While river and festival, they're not about the same thing. So this benchmark basically tests the cosine similarities between the embeddings associated with pairs of words. And this is benchmarked against actual human judgment of whether river and water are similar or not. So, and here we found that our model actually has pretty good semantic similarity. It beats the other models that we tested, both on deliberate speech audio and synthetic audio. So kind of suggesting that our model does learn something about how co-occurrences of words go together. And by that, I will say thanks a lot for your attention, and thanks to my collaborators and funding sources. Thank you.
Thanks, Greta. I have some questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that talk. It's encouraging that the cochlear ResNet shows quite a good biological plausibility score. One thing I was wondering about was, I think it's known that auditory nerve fibers can phase lock, and something that's always bugged me and other auditory neuroengineers is that we often take magnitudes of cochleograms or magnitudes of log FFTs or MEL log spectrograms. And are you aware of any experiment that actually uses these more fine time-sensitive features? And is there any additional any correlation or advantage or plausibility that our human auditory systems might be gaining from these time features? And the only nugget that I can suggest there is that there are these things called corellograms, which were done by Malcolm Slaney back on the West Coast a long time ago. And yeah, do you have any thoughts on sort of fine temporal resolution or time locking and how those might be involved in this investigation?
Yeah, thanks a lot for raising that. It's a great question because the work that I have done in that domain, that most other people have done in this field, has been with pretty, at coarse time scales. Of course, if you compare to fMRI, then you don't even have it on the brain side, so that's a problem in itself. And then, of course, there are people, research groups that do have, fine-grained recordings from intracranially, for instance. And there, I know people also have benchmarked that against model activations. I don't think they have done any fine temporal claims. And I mean, a little bit on a higher level, to your point, it's interesting because we know that humans obviously care about this super precise timing information for some things, right? Not everything, of course. But what seems to work in machine learning is that most of these audio-based models, they blur things together on pretty big scales, right? And it works. It still works to do ASR. You can do all these other things on it. So it's kind of this weird thing, oh, the models work on this averaging scheme. But wait, humans, do we also just average in our brains, or how can we get at that? I think that's a really interesting question for future work. Thanks.
Thanks. And another one is just kind of philosophical. So when I was on the West Coast at Stanford doing my PhD, information theory professor Tom Cover stopped me dead in my tracks when I said, I'm going to build a computer like the human brain. And he said, why would you settle for being just as good as the human brain? Why can't you be? We can probably make computers a lot better than the human brain. And so do you think in the neuroscience field, this is philosophical, if it turns out that we make computer hearing systems that are superhuman, do you think there will be a new hyper artificial auditory neuroscience where we start to examine only the artificial brain systems and we don't really care about biological plausibility? We're just trying to figure out how these superhuman auditory systems are doing what they're doing, and we treat them as brains in themselves rather than imitations of a human brain?
Yeah, that's a cool question. I think both things are still incredibly interesting, right? You can study a system because just knowing how it works and what it does is a core component of a way to wire up intelligence, and that's amazingly exciting, right? So even there's a lot of researchers who study these, arguably not that human-like models, and I think that's awesome because they can do things that are, biologically relevant, maybe in a very different way and better, but knowing how that happens is really interesting. And then the other camp of just studying what's human-like and biological, I guess maybe that's the camp that I fall mostly in. And I'm interested in models that have largely human performance. For instance, I don't really use any of the new LLMs because they have been there's reinforcement learning, then there's images as well. It's there's a lot of stuff going on there, and I'm but this model can do all these crazy things that I actually don't need that right now. I need to just focus on my GPT model or something like that.
But you never know. You might be the first author of a superhuman theoretical auditory neuroscience paper. So good luck. Thanks.
Thanks.
Can take one more question?
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm interested in learning more about the non-invasive control part, because intuitively I was thinking maybe the extra stimulus may be caused by dopamine and reward system regarding to those words having more emotional stimulus. Have you tried comparing graphs on other region of the brain part?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, exactly the results that I showed was from regions that we know care about language. I actually have done correlations with valence and arousal, which is a little bit what you're saying there. So instead of judging the grammaticality of a sentence, you can ask people how arousing is a sentence, or does it positive or negative? And if you correlate that, maybe I actually even have, well, that's going to be hard. Whatever, I'm not even going to try to find it. There is a correlation, so the more negative a given thing is, the higher the brain response is, even in the language regions. So that is true, that even in these regions that care about language, there is a correlation. Whether it's the core driver of the thing is unknown. And I also have looked in other brain regions. There are certain brain regions that deal with working memory, and there you also see high responses for these weird sentences, right? That make sense, they're harder to process. There are other parts of the brain where you see kind of the opposite pattern. These brain regions prefer more boring things or more introspective things. I haven't specifically targeted reward systems and dopamine, but yeah, that should definitely be possible. The data exists. Yeah. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you.
One last question. Yeah. If you can set your microphone.
Thanks, Greta. Neural audio codecs. Typically, the research, they've been using multi-scale STFT losses. Are you aware if there have been any ablations done with these biologically plausible models?
I don't know that, but I'd love to know that. So if anybody knows, then we can talk. Yeah, thanks. Happy to discuss any biologically possibility arguments and whatnot throughout the day.
Yeah, let's thank the speaker again. Thanks, Greta.
Thank you.